Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news. This is Bloomberg Businessweek Daily, reporting from the magazine that helps global leaders stay ahead, with insight on the people, companies, and trends shaping today's complex economy, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. The Bloomberg Businessweek Daily podcast with Carol Masser and Tim Stenivek on Bloomberg Radio.
I want to get back to our top story out of Washington, D.C. The president and President Zelensky of Ukraine are now talking with Europe's leaders. It's a second meeting that followed the Trump-Zelensky bilateral that we saw earlier today. The president has reiterated that he will call President Putin of Russia after talks are over, and he will try to arrange a three-way Russia-Ukraine-U.S. meeting. I want to bring in Jennifer Welch. She's been watching this very closely. She's chief geoeconomics analyst for Bloomberg Economics. She joins us from our Washington, D.C. bureau. The signs out of the meeting with Zelensky earlier today, there was certainly a different tone. Jennifer, I'm wondering how you're viewing this, and then also the commentary that we got from more than half a dozen leaders of NATO and Europe.
All signs so far look positive. The meeting is still ongoing, which is also a positive sign. This is very much a strong contrast from Zelensky's last meeting in the Oval Office, which ended early, which blew up into fireworks in front of the press. The camaraderie that Trump and Zelensky were demonstrating to each other in front of the cameras, first in their bilat, and then again when surrounded by European leaders, I think just signals how far that relationship has come. And I think in particular how far Zelensky and European leaders have come in developing a playbook for how to deal with Trump. And we saw this in the way in which they all engaged in that press conference just about an hour ago, going around the table, praising Trump, sort of incepting this idea of maybe we should really emphasize a ceasefire first to give time to negotiating a larger peace deal. And the security guarantees are going to be a really important part of this. And thank you so much, President Trump, for bringing us all here today. So I think we have moved quite a bit from where we were earlier this year. The key question, though, is what are the terms that they're all going to agree on and that Trump will then be presenting to Putin? Will those be enough to kind of get us forward momentum towards an ultimate peace deal of some sort?
Yeah, it was really interesting to just watch, at least the footage that we could see here, the European leaders and Trump. The tone looked fairly positive. People were, laughing, making jokes, at least in a lighter kind of casual sense. And you mentioned that it seems like the European leaders are taking a different approach to Trump now, maybe more willing to all work together. What, in your view, has sparked that change in tone?
I think part of it is the recognition of presenting a united front to President Trump, right? The fact that all of these leaders came into town today to join President Zelensky when he was meeting with Trump. So it's not just Zelensky and Trump one-on-one. I think that was really critical. I think also it gives Trump the opportunity to kind of play host, to look like the peacemaker, which is something he signaled over and over again he's really interested in doing. I think all of these tactics are kind of born out of seeing what didn't work earlier in the year, which was Zelensky meeting one-on-one with Trump, or rather being the only foreign representative in the Oval Office with Trump and his team, having that more combative conversation. European leaders have been coaching him behind the scenes on how to deal more effectively with Trump. And I think that has shown a lot of fruit by the time that we get to the meetings happening place today.
It's pretty remarkable that that's working so well. And it's clear. Yeah, go ahead.
No, it is. And you have some really clear players at the table earlier today, most notably the NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte, who's someone who is in part picked for that job because of his ability to know how to work well with Trump. And the fact that Trump seemed to not so subtly indicate that part of his openness to security guarantees for Ukraine is taking place in the context of what he sees as NATO agreeing to spend more on defense. NATO members beyond the United States, that is what I mean, spending more on their defense is for him a consideration when it comes to thinking about how much skin the U.S. is putting in this game for Ukraine.
What do you think they're talking about as we speak right now?
I think there are a couple of key issues that sounds like are still being worked out at the moment based on that press conference we saw the last hour. The first one is this question of, are we going for a ceasefire first or a full peace deal? Coming out of his meeting with President Putin, Trump seemed to be emphasizing, we're just going to go for the peace deal. We're not going to pause. We're not going to focus on sort of this lower end of a ceasefire. We're just going to end this thing once and for all. European leaders, Ukraine, have actually been pushing the opposite direction. They want a ceasefire first, one, because they don't want to be negotiating something as massive as a peace deal while under fire, quite literally, and two, because this tends to be kind of a Russia delay tactic to push for a larger peace deal that's going to take a long time to resolve while still trying to make gains on the battlefield. So I think that's one issue that seems clear they're going to be still discussing. A second one is going to be territorial issues. Russia, again, we don't know exactly what Putin and Trump discussed on Friday, but most likely Putin was reiterating some of Russia's longstanding demands that Ukraine cede over formal recognition of territories that Russia has occupied for some period of time, as well as withdraw from territory that Russia doesn't currently control but would like to occupy. Those have been non-starters for Ukraine and by extension for a lot of European leaders as well. And then the third issue that I think they're likely to discuss, it was a huge point of emphasis in that press conference, is what are the nature of security guarantees that the US and Europe will be providing to Ukraine to hold this deal firmly in place. President Trump said himself that he wants the deal to last. He doesn't want to have to be going at this again in a couple of years if the deal breaks down and we see conflict heat back up again. That's also a key concern for European and obviously Ukrainian leaders as well. Security guarantees could ideally hold that deal in place so that we're not just existing in some sort of frozen armistice or frozen conflict that could reheat at any point in time.
Given the fact that Russia is not in the room right now, Putin is not there as a part of any of these discussions, how much progress can the EU and Zelensky and Trump make on all of these points that you raise right now with Russia not there?
I think from European and Ukrainian leaders' perspective, what they're probably more focused on, even obviously they all want to reach a peace deal, but they want to reach the right peace deal for Ukraine. They don't want to make concessions just so that Russia will agree to it that could end up compromising Ukraine's security and by extension, Europe's security down the line. I think what they're more focused on in this current moment in time is making sure that they don't look like the obstacles to peace. So in a sense, a still positive outcome for them out of this meeting would be they get Trump to agree to certain terms or conditions. He's said earlier he was going to call Putin right after this meeting. If Putin doesn't agree to them, now Putin's the one who's vetoing the peace process, right? And the onus is back on him and back on Moscow. I think it's very likely that we're going to reach a sort of stalemate here, just given how far apart the different parties of this are on the key terms for a deal, and the fact that Russia probably still thinks time is on its side. And so it's playing for that time because it thinks the more that it has time to make gains on the battlefield, the more it will win back, the more fatigued the West will become, and the more likely President Trump will move on to other issues. So they are not necessarily genuinely interested in resolving this conflict at this moment in time. And I think that reduces the chance that they'll agree to anything, even terms that could otherwise be considered relatively favorable to
So
them.
what does that mean? You said stalemate, but a continuation of what we've been seeing?
Continuation of the conflict, potentially a continuation of efforts at peace. But ultimately, we think Moscow isn't really interested in ending the war right now, let alone agreeing to some sort of ceasefire or something that would put it on pause and give Ukraine a chance to kind of recoup and reconstitute its forces.
Jennifer, 30 seconds left here. What position does that leave Europe in?
I think Europe's main focus right now is maintaining that united front, figuring out ways that they can backfill support for Ukraine without the United States being the direct provider of it. And so far, this weapons for money scheme that they've worked out with the U.S. seems to be working.
Jennifer Welch, always great when you join us. We really appreciate you taking the time this afternoon. Jennifer Welch is Chief Geoeconomics Analyst for Bloomberg Economics. Check out her research on the Bloomberg Terminal and the entire team's analysis from Bloomberg Economics on the Bloomberg Terminal and at Bloomberg.com. Stay with us. More from Bloomberg Businessweek Daily coming up after this.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Businessweek Daily Podcast. Catch us live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 Eastern. Listen on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Or watch us live on YouTube.
I want to right now bring in Dr. Angela Sten. She's Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, also the author of Putin's World, Russia Against the West and With the Rest. She's a former National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia at the National Intelligence Council. She served in the Office of Policy Planning at the U.S. Department of State. She joins us from Nantucket this afternoon. Dr. Sten, I'm sure, like you and the rest of the world, like us, we watched the meeting just now, that press availability, what we heard from these European leaders with great interest, what we heard from Zelensky and Trump in the Oval Office earlier with great interest. One word kept coming up over and over again: trilateral, the idea of meeting to end this war between Russia, Ukraine, and the United States. Is this finally the beginning of the end of this war?
I would definitely hope that it is. But I'm still not convinced that President Putin would be interested in a trilateral meeting. He had what seemed to be a very successful meeting with President Trump on Friday in Alaska, where we had President Trump seemingly agreeing with everything that President Putin said. We heard something different today from President Trump in the Oval Office. And by the way, it was a great relief that there was a successful meeting between Presidents Trump and Zelensky in the Oval Office when you think back to the last time that President Zelensky was there. But the fact that President Trump was willing to say that the U.S. would consider security guarantees to Ukraine were there to be a peace agreement, and even, possibly supplying more military assistance to Ukraine. This is not something that we heard on Friday in Alaska. And Putin has already come out today and said that the Russia would not accept any Western troops in Ukraine. He's in fact said that before. He reiterated that now. So it just makes one wonder whether Putin would be really willing to sit down with President Zelensky and presumably President Trump as well, to sincerely negotiate an end to this war.
Dr. Stent, the two world leaders, Trump and Putin, they met on Friday for hours on end. This meeting that we've seen so far, at least between Zelensky and Trump, it was only about 30 minutes. What is your take on really who came out stronger after the Alaska meeting? Was this a win for Putin?
Well, I would argue that it was largely a win for Putin. I mean, here is an indicted war criminal being given the red carpet treatment, literally, arriving in the United States, meeting with the President of the United States. He hadn't had a meeting with the President of the United States since 2007 on U.S. soil. You had President Trump going into the meeting saying that a ceasefire had to precede negotiations. And he came out saying, no, we'll go right to the negotiations without a ceasefire. And the reason why Putin doesn't want a ceasefire is because he wants to go on fighting. In fact, as all these talks are going on in Washington, the Russians are bombarding the Ukrainians. So it definitely seemed from that Friday meeting that Putin had won a great deal. And if you look at the Russian media, I mean, they were quite ecstatic after this meeting, because they said, finally, we're back to where we want to be. Russia's a great power. And Putin got his meeting with the American president.
And potentially, President Putin gets some land from Ukraine at the conclusion of this conflict. Do you think that will happen, Dr. Stent?
I think it's going to be very difficult. By the way, when you hear the phrase land swap, there's no land swap.
Right.
I mean, the Russians want the Ukrainians to concede or to cede territory to them that they don't control. And this is quite strategic territory. Were the Ukrainians to cede that, they'd be in a weaker position. So I think that they would only get that if the Ukrainians really feel that they have ironclad guarantees, as much as that's possible, from the U.S. and from our European allies to deter Russia from any future attack. So I think that would probably depend on it.
What would those guarantees be if up to now there have been no repercussions apart from sanctions or even secondary sanctions on Russia as a result of what it's done in Ukraine?
Yeah. So they're now talking about Article 5 type guarantees. Article 5 is, the essence of the NATO alliance, which is if one member is attacked, the other members will come to its defense, as NATO did after 9/11 when the U.S. was attacked. I'm not sure that anyone really believes that if Russia were, say, to attack Ukraine again, you would have the guarantors then get into a war with Russia, because you always come back to the question that Russia is a nuclear power and everything that involves. So it's still difficult to understand what security guarantees would mean in this situation. Maybe at a minimum, it would mean sort of arming Ukraine to the teeth, and the Ukrainian army is now very strong anyway, as a way of deterring Russia. If the Russians really think, as they mistakenly thought that the Ukrainians would capitulate when they invaded in 2022. If now they believe that if they invaded again, they really would be faced with a very strong Ukrainian army that could push them back, maybe that's a security guarantee. It really is harder to imagine any other one that would be credible.
How should we be thinking about territory right now? Is it fair to say that Ukraine is going to have to cede some territory in order for the war to end?
I think what the Ukrainians will have to do at a minimum is to recognize that Russia does now occupy 20% of Ukraine. That doesn't mean de jure recognition, but de facto does. But that's without ceding more territory to Russia. I think the Ukrainians won't have any choice if the war is to end, but for the time being, to have that land under Russian occupation.
What would this land symbolize to Europe as a result of Russia's ambitions on the continent? The idea that that Russia could go to war with a country, and even, yes, after a 3.5-year very bloody and terrible war for both sides, end with additional territory.
I mean, it's a terrible precedent. Because since World War II, this is the first time you've had a major war with a land grab like that, entirely unprovoked. So the precedent for the Europeans, I think, would be very worrying, and particularly for those former Soviet states, i.e. the Baltic states, or former members of the Warsaw Pact, Poland, for instance, that are in the vicinity there, and where we know that certainly Russia might have designs, certainly on the Baltic states. So it's a very dangerous precedent, not only for Europe, but really for the rest of the world, that a land grab like that, unprovoked, goes unpunished.
We're speaking right now with Dr. Angela Stent, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, the author of Putin's World, Russia Against the West and with the Rest. Dr. Stent, does it set a precedent for what could happen to a country like Poland, for example? Is it crazy for us to think that that Putin would... the whole narrative, right, in the last few years and at the beginning of this was what's to stop him moving past Ukraine and into greater Europe? Is that a realistic thing for us to talk about, or is that something that would never happen?
So I think Poland is a member of NATO, and therefore, so far, right until this point, Russia has not directly attacked a NATO member state, which leads to the argument, correct, I think, that had Ukraine been a member of NATO, Russia wouldn't have attacked it. But we now know that NATO membership at the moment is off the table for Ukraine. So it would be unprecedented because, again, if Russia were to try to invade Poland, then you would have NATO Article 5 guarantees, and then you could have a major war between Russia and NATO, which, of course, includes the United States. So the two nuclear superpowers, which would be, potentially very dangerous.
Trump has said that Putin wants to see the war ended. I'm wondering, in your view, if you think Putin is showing any sense of urgency to end it.
Putin's not showing any signs of urgency. Putin only wants the war to end on his terms. And right now, his terms are very different than what President Trump and the European leaders and President Zelensky are discussing, because he wants Ukraine to cede all of this territory. He wants Ukraine to cut down on the size of its military, to promise that it will never join NATO. And so he would essentially, he wants the war to end with Ukraine's subjugation. And that's not what's on the table today at the White House.
One thing that I found noticeable today was the topic of children in this conflict. And it's not something we talk about every day. We probably should talk about it every day. We had President Zelensky talk about a letter that he received from the First Lady of the U.S., Melania Trump, on this subject. The president mentioned children in the conflict. We had European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen mention children in the conflict. Is the narrative shifting a little bit?
So first of all, the letter that he was talking about was actually a letter that the First Lady of the United States wrote to Putin, and which President Trump gave to Putin at the summit, which had to do with children. I think it's unfortunate that in many ways the US media haven't talked about this enough. The Russians have abducted about 20,000 Ukrainian children, taken them away from their families, forced them either into the occupied areas of Ukraine or to Russia, trying to annihilate their Ukrainian identity. And by the way, this is part of a broader problem, which is the way that the Russians are treating Ukrainians in the occupied areas, which Russia now controls, which is they're treating them very badly, to put it mildly. It's good that this has now come up to this level, and that the First Lady of Ukraine has apparently written a letter to the U.S. First Lady thanking her for bringing this up. But I think there should be much more focus on the humanitarian catastrophe that has befallen so many Ukrainians in this war.
What do you mean by that?
Well, just first of all, the abduction of children, the bombing of civilians, the bombing of maternity hospitals, all of the things that the Russians have done in terms of their attacks on Ukraine, what it's done to families, the thousands of millions of refugees, really, and displaced people. All of that is part of this war. And we probably don't read enough about that or see enough in the media.
Right. And these are attacks that are ongoing to this day, even as we have the leaders coming together and talking about, a potential end to the war. What would an end look like? Is a ceasefire something that, we should be paying closer attention to? Would a ceasefire stop the fighting and these humanitarian issues that you bring up?
Well, a ceasefire might, if it were properly observed. But even then, even if they did say, well, we agree to a ceasefire, it has to be properly implemented. It has to be properly monitored. So that in itself, could be more complicated. And the thing about the ceasefire is it would be important that it not be one in which Russia could then recoup and then attack Ukraine again. So you could have, a 30-day ceasefire, which is what people were talking about a few months ago, and then in the interim, then you could negotiate more of a peace settlement. I just heard one of the people in the press conference talk about maybe some kind of a pause if there were to be a trilateral meeting, which, as I said, I don't think is very likely soon, but at least to have a pause in the fighting. But so far, when the Russians have said that they would observe, there was a brief ceasefire that was supposed to be observed just in terms of attacking the energy infrastructure of the other countries. They didn't do it. So even that would have to be very closely monitored to make sure that the Russians didn't violate it.
We're speaking with Dr. Angela Stent, senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, also the author of Putin's World, Russia Against the West and With the Rest. A reminder of where we are right now. The president participated in a so-called family photo with European leaders at the White House in the last hour. He, alongside President Zelensky and Europe's leaders, spoke after their first meeting ended. The second meeting now underway with European and NATO leaders. The president reiterated that he will call Putin after the meetings, and he will try to arrange a three-way meeting after that. Dr. Stent, what do you make of the notion that the president, at the end of the speaking to reporters in the Oval Office, said that he would call Putin after the meetings? What does that mean to you? What does that symbolize to you?
Well, it symbolizes to me that even though he's making an effort now, obviously with our allies, to listen to their concerns as he tries to bring peace, he had apparently quite what he considered a successful summit with President Putin. And he wants to keep President Putin informed of what's going on. And so it means he wants to keep up all of those contacts with President Putin and make sure that Putin doesn't change his mind about anything.
On the prospects here for a trilateral meeting, do you think that something would have to maybe give way before we see Trump, Zelensky, and Putin all in the same room together?
Yes, I mean, so far President Putin has refused to sit down with President Zelensky because he doesn't consider Zelensky his equal. And because, as he keeps saying, Zelensky is an illegitimate president because they haven't had elections in Ukraine since the war began, presidential elections, because there's a war going on with martial law. So is what would have to change. It's Putin being willing to do that. And again, he's already been criticized by the more militant bloggers in Russia for sitting down with President Trump and talking about peace. So he in some ways, he has to worry about domestic opinion. That is to say, the people who are, fanatically in favor of continuing this war.
Right. So how are we supposed to understand, Trump's comments then? He said to reporters today, if everything works out well today, we'll have a trilat. We're going to work with everyone. I mean, how do we interpret that then?
Well, I think that's probably what President Trump would like. And he would like people to believe that he can bring that about. But, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to happen. We don't know what President Putin told him privately in Alaska. Maybe he believes that Putin would be willing to sit down with President Zelensky. But again, those of us that follow this very closely and follow what Putin says and does, we'd be more skeptical about it.
On a weapons front, the idea of the U.S. supporting Ukraine through weapons sales or weapons sales to European allies, does that continue? Does the U.S. have the appetite for that? Do politicians have the appetite for that? J.D. Vance, the vice president, has been outspoken about this, at least before he became vice president.
Well, we've barely started the process by which the Europeans are going to be purchasing weapons from the United States and then giving them to Ukraine. There's been an agreement on it. My sense is that it hasn't actually begun yet because the Europeans are waiting to get these weapons from the United States. I think that will continue as long as President Trump's MAGA base understands that, in fact, manufacturing those weapons and selling them to the Europeans, these are American jobs. I mean, much of the assistance that the U.S. has given to Ukraine, even since the war began in February of 2022, has been, enhanced the American economy and given Americans who work in the arms industry and things like that jobs. So I think that would continue. I think that what is more difficult, I think, for President Trump would be to say that we'll supply weapons to Ukraine without making them pay for it.
Just zooming out here, what do you think are the key takeaways that are going to come out of the meeting with the EU? What is at stake for the EU leaders here? And when we're talking about this, this meeting tomorrow, what do you think we're going to be talking about?
Well, I think the EU leaders really would like to have a ceasefire in place, even though President Trump has now said maybe we don't need one. That'll be one thing they'll focus on. And then I think the security guarantees, talking about, well, if Ukraine is forced to make some kind of territorial concession to Russia, then are we sure that there will be real security guarantees which are backed up by the United States?
One thing that we were talking about before we heard from these European leaders and before we heard from Zelensky was how earlier the European leaders actually met ahead of time at, I believe it was at the Ukrainian embassy, but do not quote me on that. I'm just looking through my notes here. They met ahead of their meeting at the White House today to get aligned on what their goals were. What would you say their goals are? Obviously, they want an end to the war, but what do they want that end to look like? What are they unified on?
Well, they did meet at the Ukrainian embassy earlier today. You can look at the pictures of it.
Great.
Well, they want to make sure that this war ends in such a way that Russia, it's easy to say, as President Trump did earlier, will never again attack Ukraine. Given, hundreds of years of history, I think you have to be cautious about saying that. But to ensure that for the foreseeable future, Russia will not be tempted to attack Ukraine again, and that Russia, under Putin even, will be willing to accept an independent, sovereign Ukraine, which is free to make its own decisions, if we put the NATO issue aside, about where to align itself in foreign policy. So they want to make sure not only that the war ends, but that it won't start again in 2 or 3 years.
I want to get your thoughts on NATO here, just as we talk about, this meeting with the EU. Is there any chance that we would see Ukraine get added to NATO, or is all of this kind of making the chances lessen?
Or would that be a precondition on Vladimir Putin's side, that he says, no, you cannot add Ukraine to NATO?
Well, Putin, that's one of the conditions he has, which is that Ukraine can't join NATO. But I don't think anyone's going to agree to that. I think what the U.S. side would say is not for the time being. And I think certainly President Trump has said that. Might Ukraine join NATO in the future? That's quite possible. It'll depend, on what happens to NATO. It'll depend on what happens after the end of the war. So it's not on the horizon. But it also, I think you can't expect Ukraine or its European backers to say that it will never join NATO.
Why do you think that European leaders are right now all visiting the White House 3.5 years into this? Is it President Trump who's brought them together? Why didn't they do this 2 weeks after the war started, a month after the war started, a year after the war started? Why is this happening now?
Well, because I think under the Biden administration, first of all, they believed that the U.S. was giving a lot of support to Ukraine, and they let the U.S. do that. They were still in the mindset that the U.S., was the most powerful country, had all the weapons. So I think it's a combination of factors. I think it's because the war's gone on for so long. Then you have President Trump coming in and saying he's going to end the war quickly, also questioning NATO, also questioning why the U.S. should be supporting NATO, all of these things. I think what happened at the end of February with the disastrous Oval Office meeting, the previous one with President Zelensky, was a wake-up call. But I think the real wake-up call is understanding that they cannot any longer rely on the United States to support them for their security, or really to provide for their security in the way that it used to, and that they have to take much more of a burden on themselves. And then I think the other factor is clearly realizing after the Alaska summit, but even before then, that they weren't quite sure, that President Trump, wasn't willing to tell Ukraine that it had to accede to Russian demands, which would, could also be quite dangerous for Europe. So I think it's a combination of factors.
Do you see it as a good sign, though?
I do, because I think that President Trump, first of all, will understand now that the Europeans are really quite united about this, and that they're backing Ukraine.
So, Dr. Sten, I want to end the interview with the question that I always ask you, and I've asked you this for the last 3.5 years, and I want to know if your answer has changed based on today. How does this war end?
I don't think anyone knows how it ends yet. The best solution would be a negotiated settlement, which doesn't take too long, which doesn't involve too many concessions, and which guarantees that Russia will not, in the near future, again, try and attack Ukraine.
Is it closer now to ending than at any point that we spoke to you in the past 3.5 years?
Possibly. There's too much that we don't know, but possibly it is, yeah.
Okay. Want to let you go. You've been so generous with your time today, Dr. Stent. Really appreciate you joining us. That's Dr. Angela Stent. She's senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. She's the author of Putin's World, Russia Against the West and With the Rest. She's also a former national intelligence officer for Russia and Eurasia at the National Intelligence Council. She also served in the Office of Policy Planning at the U.S. Department of State. She's been a go-to voice over the last 3.5 years for us as we've reported on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Stay with us. More from Bloomberg Businessweek Daily coming up after this.
This is the Bloomberg Businessweek Daily podcast. Listen live each weekday starting at 2 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Shares of the green hydrogen company Plug Power closed 2.5% lower last Tuesday. That was the first day of trading after the company reported net revenue for the second quarter that came in above estimates. But the bottom line was the issue. EPS missed the average analyst estimate. Plug provides hydrogen products, including electrolyzers, hydrogen transport, storage, and dispensing solutions, and more, to a variety of customers, including Walmart, Amazon, Home Depot, Airbus, AT&T, Kroger, FedEx, PG&E, Coca-Cola, and more. We've got back with us Andy Marsh, the CEO of Plug Power. He joins us from just outside of Albany. Andy, always good to have you on the program. I want to start with your customers. I mentioned just about 10 of them. The list goes on. What are you hearing from them in a world where green energy is no longer sort of the buzz phrase, the buzzword? There's not the same government incentives for this stuff that there was in the last administration. What are you hearing from them right now?
So the last part of that, Tim, is not true. The incentives for 48E, which is the tax credit for fuel cells, in the last bill is actually much better than it was.
Well, I was talking about green energy as sort of a monolith, just to be clear.
Yeah. So when I look at it, first globally, the incentives for hydrogen and fuel cells and green energy remains robust. And if you look at our business in the second quarter, our revenue in Europe for electrolyzers, and all of it's really primarily Europe, actually tripled to $45 million from what it was a year ago. And here in the United States, when we look at the tax landscape, the credit landscape, we actually see it better today than it was a year ago. So
why is that then?
Really happy with, well, I think because when you looked at the tax credit for fuel cells, it was, not well structured or positioned in 48E. And we see an extension of what was essentially the ITC, which was extended the last time under President Trump in 2018, in the latest bill, which extends a credit for fuel cells, which is used by Amazon, Walmart, and many of the customers you mentioned through 2032. So we're actually pretty thrilled with what happened for hydrogen, especially in the last bill.
When you look at Plug Power's earnings, the margins are still negative, but they have improved from the last year. What are your thoughts on just how much more runway you guys need before Plug Power is consistently profitable?
Yeah. So, I think you hit on the point. We moved gross margins from a year ago by over 60%, and we are targeting to be gross margin zero by the fourth quarter. And there's a clear map with our hydrogen plants and the improvements we've seen in service, and more importantly, selling more. And that really helps us a great deal. And we're targeting being EBITDA positive by the end of next year. And I think with our Project Quantum Leap, where we really focused on cost and selling, that we are on the right track. And I think you're beginning to see it in the financials. Even the miss on EPS was write-downs, which were non-cash write-downs associated with our plans to really align the business for the future to be successful.
What's the U.S. market right now for green hydrogen? That's hydrogen made from water using clean electricity to power the electrolysis process.
So, to be straight, it is a bit slower than what you see in Europe and other places. Our primary focus for electrolyzers are really Europe, Australia, where the climate's right. But we actually operate the largest green hydrogen, liquid hydrogen plant in the world at the moment in Georgia. And when I I reviewed this morning our demand for hydrogen from the second quarter to the fourth quarter, we actually see that our daily usage go up from 55 tons per day to about 67 tons per day by the end of the year. So we're using our plants. We're creating green hydrogen. We're involved in some blue hydrogen projects. So we feel comfortable about the long-term trajectory and even near-term trajectory for hydrogen in the United States.
Talk a little bit more about that demand and where it's coming from. Are you seeing customers, pivoting from other sources of energy, or are you seeing, just increasing need for more sources of energy, and that's what's really driving your growth here?
That's actually a real good question, because when we look at the world, the United States, with what we've deployed already, that's 275 sites in our material handling business across the U.S., we've actually taken off the grid approximately 500 megawatts of electricity. And as I think everybody knows, it has become more and more challenging to bring electricity there's over a 3.5-year backlog to get electricity to facilities. Typical distribution center, we take off 2 to 3 megawatt off the grid, which can then be used for things like increasing freezer capabilities. So if you're a food retailer and you want to sell more frozen goods, which is a growth area, one way you can increase the size of your freezer and not have to worry about the power needs is actually use fuel cells and hydrogen from Plug Power.
We're speaking with Andy Marsh, the CEO of Plug Power, joining us from just outside of Albany. Andy, I want to go back to regulatory issues, tax credits, and that sort of thing, because you did say that demand is better, or we were in a better position than you were a year ago. Our own Will Wade and team reporting that a year ago, credits were expected to help lead about 1.2 million metric tons of annual green hydrogen production by 2030. That's according to BNEF, our in-house Bloomberg New Energy Finance. Now, projects with just 150,000 tons of production capacity are expected to qualify for the incentives, dramatically reducing anticipated U.S. output. This is after the Trump administration's tax and spending legislation significantly limited tax credits to produce the fuel. How is that affecting you?
Well, when I look at, I'm already using the tax credits. We expect to have online our additional Texas plant by 2028 before they expire, which allows us to use those credits through 2032. I think when we look at our own needs, we're looking at other expansion opportunities. We think that we'll be able to generate the hydrogen to meet our customers' needs and be able to take tax credits through 2032. So, quite honestly, I'm very comfortable with the present legislation.
Back in January, there was a Bloomberg News story about the White House confirming a $1.6 billion loan guarantee for Plug Power to build hydrogen plants. How have you guys received that loan yet? And how crucial is support like that to continue to grow Plug Power?
It's important, but it's not. We will still move ahead with building plants. Ultimately, we're focused, and I've been down to the DOE recently, and we're working on details to make sure we can pull down funding for the plant in Texas, which is a plant that gets very, very low cost electric energy from a NextEra wind farm. When we take a look at that, we're working through the final details to start being able to pull down funding from the DOE. I know they've canceled many projects. We haven't been on the cancel list, and we have a good relationship. I think the Trump administration and their goals of being energy dominant, the world's going to want green SAF. The world's going to want green ammonia. The U.S. is well positioned to be the leader in providing those fuels, and green hydrogen is critical to becoming energy dominant for the long term. Additionally, hydrogen generation is really important for national security. I mean, next to SpaceX, all the vehicles use hydrogen. So when you really think about the long-term benefits, and then on top of that, when you think about hydrogen, over 30% of retail food move through a Plug Power fuel cells. Boy, you don't want that disrupted overnight.
No, you don't. Andy, we only have about a minute and a half left, and I want to talk about the stock price. It's down about 97% since the 2021 highs. Even though you're a relatively small company, you're still among, at least today, the most actively traded stocks with $54.7 million shares rather, trading today. It's massive. The volume this year has been massive. You've got 28% of your shares floated. What's your message to investors and traders right now?
Well, I think I would tell them it's a great opportunity to come in. You can look at the financials, revenue growing at 20%, gross margin improving dramatically. The deployments in Europe, where the electrolyzer industry is really happening today, has tripled in the past year. I think this is the opportunity to successfully enter the stock. And it's one of the reasons our CFO has made significant investments, and I'm putting about 25% of my salary to work buying stock, actually 50% of my salary to work buying stock every week.
Andy, thanks for coming on. Appreciate you taking the time this afternoon. Always good to check in with you, and it has been quite a few months since we last spoke, so don't be a stranger. Come back soon. Andy Marsh, CEO of Plug Power, joining us from just outside of Albany. Stay with us. More from Bloomberg Businessweek Daily coming up after this.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Businessweek Daily Podcast. Catch us live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 Eastern. Listen on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Or watch us live on YouTube.
I'm driving in my car.
How about you let me drive?
Oh, no. This is not a toy.
Who's gonna drive you home?
Honey, please, I'll do the driving.
Drive on.
Excuse me, I want to drive.
It's the question that drives us.
This is the Drive to the Close.
That funky music will drive us till the dawn.
On Bloomberg Radio.
All right, welcome back, guys. It's time for the Drive to the Close. We're here today with Andrew Cry. He's co-chief investment officer at Crescent Grove Advisors. It's got about $5 billion in AUM. Andrew's joining us from Milwaukee. We've been talking all about geopolitics today. We've been talking about the meeting at the White House with Ukrainian President Zelensky, Trump, and a number of other European leaders. So we have to start there, Andrew. How are you factoring in geopolitical risk into your investment strategy right now?
I would say from our perspective, I think the markets have largely been desensitized to the geopolitical circumstances that we found ourselves in now for the last several years, whether you look at Russia, Ukraine, you look at the situation in the Middle East. Perhaps there's a little bit of excess risk premium that could still be wrung out if we were to find some sort of resolution over the coming weeks and months. But nonetheless, we tend to think it's more about just the fundamental economic drivers, the business cycle, the Fed. We're more focused, let's say, on Jackson Hole this week than we are on what's happening with these geopolitical negotiations that are happening.
Let's go to the Federal Reserve and to Friday, where we'll hear from Fed Chair Jay Powell. Emily, remind me, what was the Fed theme this year?
Oh, I don't have it in front of me, the title, but it's labor. It's about labor.
It's about labor. And
some fancy words.
We spoke to Jim Bianco earlier about the changing labor market. And I mean, he's kind of just blowing my mind with this idea that if we don't have immigration into the U.S., the numbers that we'll see when it comes to the monthly jobs report will be very tiny. And I'm wondering how you're looking at the labor market. Obviously, that's half of the Fed's dual mandate. What does Jay Powell say about it? How does it shift in this no immigration environment?
Yeah, I think that's a key factor to look at for sure. I think you've ended up in this situation where we're kind of low hiring, low firing. I think that's actually a phrase he's used now several times. But we've got a situation where one of the metrics we look at is continuing claims as a percentage of the labor force. It's ticked up modestly, but it's not anything that's terribly concerning, particularly in a historical context. You look at sort of initial claims. Yeah, they've moved up somewhat, but again, not to the point where it's ultimately an acute issue, we would say, again, from a labor perspective. So I think it's something that the Fed's clearly watching. And you go back to the jobs report most recently and the revisions that we saw. Needless to say, they're going to be concerned about it, and that was a real headline grabber. But I think they've got this dual mandate, and they're going to have to balance, sort of a pick your poison scenario here, where they want to support the labor market that might be softening somewhat, or do they want to risk, inflation ticking back up because they're cutting and providing stimulus in an environment where inflation hasn't really been tamed at this point. And I think there's still a lot of uncertainty around the tariff impact on inflation.
Yeah, there is certainly a lot of kind of, I guess, just still lack of clarity on how the tariffs are being passed on to companies and being passed on to consumers. What's your assessment right now of whether consumers are feeling the effects of tariffs? Or have you seen, at least in the earnings, that the companies are, I guess, the party able to absorb the tariff increases?
Yeah, I think what we've seen so far is that there's clearly a lagged effect here that's happening. There's an element where companies are able to absorb some of the price increases. I think it's yet to be seen the full impact, and if we're able to kind of spread this over a long enough period in terms of these incremental pricing increases along the way, then maybe we don't see a real uptick in inflation in sort of a meaningful, acute way. Kind of this concerning number where CPI spikes, PCE spikes, those sorts of things. But we just slowly kind of adjust and see this, not a step function change again, but just an insidious level of sort of inflation building in the system. And then I think part of the argument that the Fed's making here too for being a little bit more, I guess, cautious about this whole scenario is that it could really just be a one-time reset then as well, right? And then we start going to comps next year on a year-over-year basis. And once we've gotten through this initial wave of the tariff adjustments within pricing, then really it's all baked into the cake at that point. And we're kind of back to where we started in terms of figuring out the balance between what's fundamental inflation, what's sort of that underlying structural level of inflation, and then what's the labor market doing. And then they're balancing their dual mandate and their policy settings around those two factors.
So it sounds like what you're saying, Andrew, is you don't find the tariffs being inflationary.
Well, for sure, they will be inflationary to a degree. I think it's this idea that we were going to see this one-time or really acute sense of a 3-month period where inflation spikes really meaningfully. I don't think the evidence is suggesting that that's what we're going to see. It's going to be spread out over several months, which I guess tells us that we just have to be a little bit more patient in terms of understanding the full impact of these tariff levels, which, mind you, are still changing as well. I think that's part of the other issue.
So how should investors and traders think about that? Like, in the sense of how should they think about them still changing, or should they think about them being, well, President Trump's favorite word in the dictionary is tariff, so they're here at least while he's president?
Yeah, I think we've reverted back to some level now of what we can expect going forward in terms of, we look at the most extreme version that was put forth going back to the March, April Liberation Day discussions, right? And we've reverted back to something that's not nearly as extreme as that. So if there's some band, I guess, around where we are today, okay, that's reasonable enough. But I think from investors' perspectives, we start to zoom out and look at sort of derivative effects of everything related to not only tariff policy, but broader trade policy, broader America First policy. And for us, that's still this sort of incremental shift away from dollar assets from U.S. markets, looking at things that might be cheaper in non-U.S. markets in particular, in areas where we've potentially got a catalyst as well. So like Europe, for instance, where now they're loosening the fiscal purse strings. They've got consumers that didn't spend down all of their COVID stimulus that are still pretty well healed from a savings perspective that could support their economy were they to fall on a little bit of a hard time. But we just tend to think that there's an interesting catalyst in non-U.S. markets. And again, this idea that the dollar may not be kind of the end-all be-all that it once was, this haven currency for a variety of reasons, not least of which is the policies we've talked about.
Andrew Cry, Co-Chief Investment Officer at Crescent Grove Advisors.
This is the Bloomberg Businessweek Daily podcast. Available on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Listen live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 p.m. Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, TuneIn, and the Bloomberg Business app. You can also watch us live every weekday on YouTube and always on the Bloomberg Terminal.